there's life, there's all kinds of great stuff that's growing in there and just wonderful. So xeriscape is definitely not xeriscape, and it can be important to remember that. There are, by definition, 7 different steps to start a xeric garden, according to Denver Water. We'll go through a couple of these, but I'm trying to focus more on the pollinator side, so I'll talk about the first half a little bit more, and then we'll move into our pollinators. But first off, you want to make a plan. You don't want to just go at it willy-nilly, because then you might get overwhelmed, or you might end up not ending up where you want to be. Next is to figure out your soil situation. Do you need to amend it? Do you need to leave it be? Next is to think about irrigation. Make sure that it is effective, it's efficient. Mulch can be a really important aspect, whether you're using rock mulch or organic wood chip kind of mulch. Right plant, right place, I tend to think kind of is similar with the plan. Alternative turfs or ground covers. This is a buffalo grass lawn right here in this middle picture. And then maintaining it properly. It's going to be a different method to maintain a xeric garden than it is to maintain a traditional cool season turf, for example. Okay, this is where I'm going to do 5 minutes of soil science. Effectively, it's important that you understand your soil and where your soil is before you do any major changes to your landscape, or even when you're just managing the landscape as it is. Because understanding your soil and the properties it has helps you to water more effectively, to grow your plants more effectively, and just to have more success. The big things that I like folks to know about soil is that clay is a very strong component of soil. So this is a soil texture triangle. And there are 3 main soil particles in differing sizes, clay being the smallest, silt being a little bit larger, and sand being much larger. Those in mixture create your soil texture. Realistically, there is no way that you will ever change your soil texture. Soil texture is going to remain the way that it is unless you're looking at actually physically replacing your soil. You can, however, change your soil tilth. You can change how that soil acts. So if you have a clay soil, and if you look, you can have as little as 20% clay, and it could still be a sandy clay loam. Clay is a very strong particle, and it changes the soil properties quite substantially based on its size. You can change your soil tilth. So soil amendment can be an important step when you're looking at starting your xeric garden. You might do a soil test first off to see where you are at already. If you have a lot of organic material in your soil, it's not likely that you're going to need to amend any organic material like compost. Tilth, someone asked what is tilth? Tilth is how your soil interacts with plants and with life. A soil that has a good tilth is easy to work. It's not usually as compacted. A soil that has very poor tilth might be rock hard and you can't get anything into it. And the soil preparation I'm talking about here is the ways in which you can improve the tilth of your soil, not your texture, but your tilth. So overall, in terms of amendment, you can use organic materials if warranted. If you've already got a lot of organic material in your soil, which you can find out from a soil test, then you're good to go. But you might mix in some kind of inorganic material. If it's a brand new landscape and you want to make sure that your soil is easy to work really quickly, mixing in something like an expanded shale or a pea gravel, sometimes it's called squeegee, could be a way to go. You're probably not putting a whole bunch in, but it's something that you could consider as an amendment especially for a xeric garden. If you're looking at traditional gardens, something like that is not going to be as relevant. In terms of where to get your soil tested, you can go to CSU at the CSU Spur campus. They have a soil testing lab. There's also Ward Labs, W-A-R-D, and Weld Labs, W-E-L-D, are both commercial labs. That's what they do all day, every day. They're going to get soil tests back to you a little bit quicker, perhaps, than CSU might, but it's totally up to you where you want to go. Soil tests tend to range in price from about $25 to about $40 for just the basic soil test. And it's going to tell you what your soil texture is, so that sand, silt, clay, and it will tell you what the snapshot of nutrients in your soil are and the snapshot of organic material in your soil is at the time that you're testing it. And that's a really great way to know where you are and know where you want to go. CSU Extension can definitely help once you get those results back and you know what your goals are in terms of getting things getting things together for your landscape. So is it a good idea to amend or not to amend? Sometimes it can be good, sometimes it might not be necessary. In terms of a Waterwise garden, compost or garden soil might be a little too much for the plants that you're putting in. These plants evolved in dry spaces, dry areas. They don't necessarily need a whole bunch of organic material mixed in. If it's already there, you can definitely work with it. Usually if you water a little bit less, then you might be able to lean that soil down a little bit. But natives might prefer a soil that drains well or gets watered less. So you can use things like expanded shale in this right-hand picture, or other rock materials. We don't have a whole ton of research just yet on what amending rocks in does, but often using rock as a mulch on the soil surface is going to be almost as effective, if not equally effective, as mixing it in, and a lot less work for your back. In terms of amending, you don't want to amend with too much material. This is a chart from one of our Master Gardener garden notes. But really, you're looking at incorporating 6 to 8 inches deep, and depending whether you can get a plant-based or a manure-based compost, you are putting no more than 2 to 3 inches of a plant-based, no more than 1 inch of a manure-based compost. The main reason for putting less of a manure-based compost down in is because it is higher in salts. Salts aren't necessarily the sodium chloride that you're putting in on your dinner at night. It can be calcium, magnesium, potassium, things that we often sometimes think of as nutrients, but they are salts. And so if they are in excess, then they can become problematic for plant growth. And a lot of our native plants do not need a whole lot of nutrients in order to grow effectively. So I think this is my last time where I'll just give the plug for a soil test. They're relatively inexpensive. And as somebody just put in the comment, their soil test came back good for native plants. So you don't need to necessarily do this amendment unless you have absolutely very poor soil. But yeah, in terms of mulch, that same person asked whether or not they should use a gravel mulch or a wood mulch. Really, it's a preference thing. It's going like wood mulch tends to keep the soil a little bit cooler. It tends to heat more during the day, whereas rock mulch holds heat longer throughout the night. And so it's kind of what you want for your landscape. There are a lot of Waterwise and xeric plants that really, really love to have a whole bunch of heat. So an extra rock mulch might be good for them. Okay, let's move on to a little bit on water. Watering is a really important component of our landscapes, especially if you have an established landscape that you're converting to xeriscape or to a more water-wise practice, especially if you have trees that are already established. You want to make sure that you have good water going to those trees while reducing water elsewhere in your yard. One way that's really good to do that is drip irrigation. Drip irrigation has become a lot simpler to work with and manage over the years. It's relatively inexpensive, but there are some key points to be aware of when you're working with a drip system. You want to make sure that you have a pressure reducer so that you're not blowing out the valves on a lot of these drip emitters. If the pressure is too high, there's a little rubber valve in there that will just pop right out, and then you'll just have a massive stream of water instead of a pressure regulated one. It's also really good to plan how you're going to water your landscape and make sure that your emitters are putting out enough water based on the size of the plant. As your plants grow, you may need to up the size a little bit. Also, make sure you check your system each season. They can be adjusted fairly easily. You can add another dripper if you need to. You can plug one up if you need to. And that way you're keeping things adjusted as needed. If you have a very large space, drip systems can be challenging because there's a lot to keep up with in the year. But if you have a standard yard, it's a really good way to go. I get the question a whole ton about rain barrels. Back in 2016, it became legal here in Colorado to harvest rainwater on your property. You can harvest. One person asked about how many gallon emitters to use per plant. It's really going to depend on what size the plant is, what the water needs of that plant are, how often you're running your system, and how long you're running it for. And it's going to vary depending on the plant. Some plants will need very little to none. Some plants might need substantially more. So that's the wonderful extension answer of it depends, unfortunately, for emitters, or for how much water to put on plants. But in terms of rain barrels, you're looking at, you can store up to 110 gallons of water at your property. That means it's 255 gallons or less of water at each household. You can use this to irrigate your lawns, your plants, your gardens. Depending on what your roof is like, you may or may not want to water your vegetable gardens with it. But the main thing to know in terms of rainwater harvesting, it's a great thing to do, but 110 gallons goes away very, very quickly. If you're looking at watering a standard tree, they take about 10 gallons per inch of diameter of their trunk. So if you have a 10-inch tree, in one watering session, you might be using that entire 110 gallons to water your tree. And then you're waiting until it rains again. So it's a great thing to do, but it's not going to keep your whole landscape watered. If you want to know more, you can check out the fact sheet that we have. If you look up rain barrels, CSU extension 6.707, it will get you right there. Okay, a little bit more on water, and I'll just show this comparison. If you aren't familiar with the United States Drought Monitor, they keep track of where we are in terms of moisture. And some years we are very, very dry. 3 years ago in 2021, the drought monitor had almost everywhere in Colorado was in abnormal to exceptional drought. And that changes how you think about water and how you want to interact with your plants. Generally speaking, even if we are in severe droughts like this, there are exceptions in place to allow you to keep your trees watered and a vegetable garden watered. But often it can be recommended to dry your lawn down or something like that. If you have a xeric garden, a Waterwise garden already, then you can kind of ride the storm of the drought a little bit better. This is this year. We're looking a lot better this year. We've had good moisture over the winter and even over last summer. Last year, we actually had a record-breaking 6-week spell of moisture where we had more than we've ever had on record. So we're looking pretty good for moisture overall in Colorado at the moment. But this is kind of a fun little thing. If you just do a Google search for Drought Monitor Colorado, you can check out where we're at the moment and know where you need to be and if you need to be aware. Okay, so that was my very rapid run through of xeriscape and Waterwise gardening and in the big picture. There's a lot more resources out there in terms of planning a xeriscape garden. I just don't have the scope to get into it today. So let's dive into pollinators. Who are these pollinators? What are they? They fertilize our flowers, which allows plants to produce seeds for the next year, for their next generation. They also help provide diversity in our gardens. We would not have flowers without pollinators. There are some flowers that exist without a pollinator, but overall, the flowers that we really love to look at exist solely because there are pollinators that pollinate them. Why is it important? Why do we want to have pollination? Without pollinators, we wouldn't have tomatoes, fruits, vegetables in our gardens. We would not have nearly as much to eat. Almost 90% of our flowering plants rely on some kind of pollinator for fertilization, and there are over 200,000 species of animals that act as pollinators. So why do you want a pollinator-friendly yard? Diversity. I mean, there's a time and a place for a lawn that looks like this top picture, but overall, I'd much rather spend time in this bottom picture. Um, Having that diversity allows for a variety of pollinators to come in. It's beautiful. And you can have these side by side even if both aesthetics appeal to you. There's nothing wrong with having a really nice lawn. Okay, let's pause for a moment and see if there's any questions that come in. I know that there was one that I don't think I quite got to. Oh, yes, there was somebody who asked if if a species is dependent on a pollinator, is there a certain density within a neighborhood that you need to have? I don't know enough about, I am a horticulturist, not an entomologist. I don't know enough about the ways in which native species move around to answer specifically, but most native pollinators are able to move fairly reliably about a mile around. So as long as you've got a stand of plants within about a mile radius, there should be a good variety of plants for things to grow on. Forbs. What are forbs? Forbs are herbaceous plants that grow back from the roots every year, usually perennial, sometimes annual. Any other questions? I have another couple pauses for questions later on. Let's keep going then. Okay, who are our pollinators? We've got bees, flies, wasps, beetles, butterflies. I say wasps again because people don't think of wasps as pollinators. We tend to think of the yellow jacket or the paper wasp that stings us and makes us unhappy, and then just want to get rid of wasps in every capacity. Oh, let's see. One other question is, if you have clay soil, should you only use 1 to 2 inches of wood bark because it will become waterlogged and kill roots? That is not what I am aware of. Generally speaking, if it is a wood mulch, an organic wood-based mulch, you can go 3 to 5 inches deep and still be quite safe for roots under the soil surface. That said, you don't want to have any landscape fabric in between the mulch and the soil. Landscape fabric in the long term will create more problems than it will solve. So mulch on top, great. No landscape fabric, that's not so great. Okay, yes, so our pollinators, bees, flies, wasps, beetles, all these little guys, they don't actually know that they're pollinating. They're just there to get a free source of food. First off are our bees. There are over 20,000 species of bees throughout the world, 4,000 in the United States. Most of the natives in the are in the drier areas west of the Rockies. California has about 2,000. Recent study from CU Boulder has determined that we actually do have over 1,000 species of bees in Colorado. Until last year, we were saying that there were a little over 900, so we've got more here than we realized. Sometimes it's really hard to determine a lot about how many bees we have because a lot of bees are solitary and we don't see them unless we're doing very specific studies for them. But bees are very diverse in their color, their shape, their size, their habits, how they interact. So we've got 7 different families of bees, 6 of which we've got in the United States, and 5 of which I will go over here because they're fairly common: the Coletidae, Adrenidae, Halictidae, Megachelidae, and Apidae. The Coletidae, or our plasterer bees, have actually a little split tip on their tongue, and they line their brood cells with a cellophane-like substance, which they use that tongue to paint on. And we have Coletidae, or plasterer bees, on all of the continents except for Antarctica. The Adrenidae, or mining bees, are one of the most diverse families in the United States. These are often one of the first bees that emerge in late winter, so having those early spring blooming bulbs can be a great source of food for these guys. The majority of them are solitary. Many of them nest in the ground. If you can have a bare space of soil in your landscape somewhere, you can potentially provide that doesn't get a lot of moisture and gets a fair amount of sun. You can get a really good space for these guys. There's a hiking trail I go to sometimes in Boulder, near Boulder, that has just a whole little hillside that's full of solitary bee holes. They're each individual nests, but they do it in a cluster. That kind of aggregate nesting. And the Adrenidae or mining bees have the smallest bee in the world, the Perdita minima, or pictured right here. The big bee that it's sitting on is a honeybee. So that gives you a sense of how teeny tiny that little bee is. The Halictidae, these are my favorites because I am a sucker for the iridescent bees. The sweat bees, the sweat bees tend, I'm not going to say the trail where I find them, but it's in Boulder County. If you find it, you can send me a picture. Um, the sweat bees, they are named that theoretically because they like to land on us and lap up the salt in our sweat. I've never had that happen to me. I have watched many of them, and they have ignored me, even if I've been sweating hard from working out in the yard. A lot of the sweat bees are fairly drab. They're not very colorful, but some of them are these metallic, brightly colored bees. And we do have those bright green ones here in Colorado. A lot of them will nest in the ground. Some might nest in some rotting wood. And they can be social or communal, but a lot of them are solitary as well. Megatelidae, these are the ones besides bumblebees and honeybees that you might be the most familiar with, because they're the ones that will often cut out little crescent shapes on your rose leaves, your lilac leaves, or other leaves in your landscape. They're using those leaves or those petals to line their egg cavities where they're going to lay their eggs for their young. So they're harmless in their nature, but if you're trying to raise a rose for if you're trying to raise a rose for show, maybe cover it up so that they don't chew those leaves off. Oh, great question. Somebody asked if sweat bees are attracted to flowers. Yes, they most definitely are attracted to flowers. They just got that name because they are theoretically attracted to the salts in our sweat. Megatelidae, these are the ones that move into the bee hotels most often, and sometimes you can manage them for pollination in farms or in backyards. Here's some other pictures of those leafcutter and mason bees. So this is a little nest that's already had an egg laid in it, and then they packed it with mud. When that larva is ready to mature and emerge, it will pop that plug out and come on out. Okay, apidae. These are our bumblebees, our carpenter bees and honeybees, the ones that people are very largely familiar with. They can be, as well as squash bees, which are native in our area and so cute because they sleep in our squash flowers. They can be both solitary and social. Obviously, honeybees are social. They live in a hive that they maintain through the winter. And they tend to be both ground and cavity nesters. So there's a lot of variety in the Apidae family. Honeybees in particular pollinate about 25% of our food crops. They can travel up to 2 miles from their hive, and they will visit up to 100 flowers in one trip. One worker in her lifetime will make about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. There are 3 different types of honeybees. The queen here at the bottom. The worker, that's who you're seeing most of the time. She is a girl. She's doing all the work. And the drone, which is a infertile female that, which is which hatches from an unfertilized egg. My mouth is getting ahead of my brain. But it's the vast majority of the time you will just see that worker female. She is going about getting all the pollen, getting all the nectar for the hive. Okay, somebody asked, if you plant for bees, will you also attract hornets? You will attract some wasps, most definitely, and some of them look a little bit scary. We have a fairly large, like 3/4 acre xeriscape demonstration garden that we manage in Adams County, and we get very large black wasps. They're about 3 inches long. They will not sting you unless you are being aggressive toward them. The wasps that will sting you are yellow jackets and paper wasps if you get near their nest. the vast majority of the time, people are getting stung by yellow jackets. They are very territorial, and they also like the things that we like. They like sugar and they like meat. So generally speaking, if you're getting stung, it's going to be a yellow jacket that's doing it. It's not going to be the honeybees. It's not going to be the native bees. They don't have an interest to. Honeybees in particular, they have a barbed stinger. If they sting you, it will actually eviscerate themselves, and they will die from having stung you. So they think very carefully about stinging before they do so. Generally speaking, you might have more stinging insects in your garden, but the vast majority of them, if you are moving carefully through your garden, if you are not acting like flailing around and being aggressive, you are going to be just fine and not get stung by any of our pollinators. So why are bees visiting these flowers? It's food for them. The pollen that you see on this little honeybee, these are little baskets that she has evolved to store pollen that she can bring back and feed as bee bread to immature bees and to the queen. It's their protein source. Nectar is their source of carbohydrates. They consume it for energy, they ingest it, and then they pop it back out into the honeycomb, which will eventually dry down into honey. Pollination is just a coincidental byproduct. The bees are not concerned about pollinating the flower. So what do you want to do if you want to attract bees? Generally speaking, avoid those plants that have been bred to be sterile or pollenless. I always hate this. I love and hate this slide because I love dahlias. These complex double flower dahlias are not a great pollen source. They're not a great nectar source for bees because bees can't actually get to them. So by all means plant them, but also plant something that's open and has a good shape that bees can reach out. And actually here is a great example. This is not a bee, this is a fly, whereas this one is a bee. There are mimics. I'll get into that in a little bit. But the flowers that are most attractive to bees have white, yellow, blue, purple, or violet color, usually have a floral or herbal fragrance. They're often open in shape or maybe just a shallow tube. Beans and clover, those legumes that they can kind of crawl up into. They also like small clusters of flowers together. This one is a fly again as well, whereas these are both honeybees. And they like flowers that are open during the daytime because that is when they are flying around. Generally speaking, in terms of attracting bees, if you plant it, they will come. This is our office, and I just drew a little map, a little circle on Google Maps of 2 miles. Bees can forage up to 2 miles away from their home. Natives will forage a little bit closer, but they can still travel over a mile quite easily. So if you are planting and having flowers in your landscape, you will be attracting bees into your landscape before too long. They will find you. Often it can be useful to include perennials and woody plants instead of just annuals in your landscape. They tend to have a richer nectar and act as a dependable source of food for bees and other pollinators year after year. So this is lead plant. It's a native. This is Carol Mackie Daphne, not a native, but great source of pollen and nectar for our bees. Also think about your herbs and your vegetables. If you have something that started to bolt, like some lettuce or dill or chives, you can let it go to flower, and the bees and the butterflies love those flowers. So basil, parsley, dill, cilantro, rosemary, chives, oregano, thyme, sage, letting those go to flower can be a really great way to attract some more pollinators to your landscape. Okay, other pollinators as well. Moths and butterflies can both be great options. They're easily distinguished based on their antennae. Moths have these very, very feather-like antennae. Butterflies have a simple, very slender antennae. Butterflies tend to be active during the day, whereas moths are active at night. Usually pretty easy to tell the difference between moths and butterflies, but let's talk about them a little bit more specifically. The two-tailed swallowtail is often found on or near ash trees in urban areas. They also love choke cherries, and adults can visit many different flowers for nectar. Their larvae are going to need um, other food sources. So when you're thinking about trying to attract butterflies and moths to your garden, knowing what the food sources for butterflies, and I think if possible, Ben, if you can put in that attracting butterflies fact sheet into the chat so people can see it. Planting for the larva is just as important as planting for the adults. I think that might be in another talk that I have. But another butterfly that people tend to think about is the monarch. We are not actually on a migration pathway for the monarch in Colorado, but we get cast-offs from a windstorm sometimes. We do have them here. So if you really want to attract monarchs, you can plant milkweed. And I'll talk about that in a little while later, because that is the sole source of food for the larvae, for the caterpillars of the monarch butterfly. Adults can visit many different flowers, but the larvae only visit milkweed. If you want to attract a lot of butterflies, you may want to have some kind of windbreak or other shelter that will cut the wind. You may want to provide some source of water for gathering of the plants, and to have different plant species for both the adult and the immature stages, like I said. Somebody asked about the tomato hornworm, that they eat the tomato plants. They are, they're asking if they're beneficial. Hornworms in and of themselves they're beautiful as adults because they are now the name's just gone out of my head. The butterfly moth, or the hummingbird moth, sphinx moth. So as an adult, tomato hornworms turn into the sphinx moth, which we all love to see. They're big, they're beautiful. So if you can, I always recommend planting a couple sacrificial tomatoes somewhere else in your landscape, that if you find a hornworm, you can take it over there. But if you don't love them, there are other varieties of hornworm that feed on things that are not tomatoes. And so you're not totally eradicating them if you don't want them. Oh, here's that. Okay, here's that fact sheet. And if I can't send it out to you all, but I put it in the chat. So Ben, if you can link that attracting butterflies, that would be great. So you can see here, these are the butterflies as adults. This is when they are flying, and these are the sources of food for the caterpillars and good sources of food for the adults. So that can be a really great way to ensure that you're feeding the entire life stage of the butterflies as you're trying to grow them. Okay, moths. The Shinia masoni are one of our moths that have an exclusive relationship with a plant. Both the adults and the caterpillars are only found on Gaillardia aristata, the blanket flower, which is native to our foothills. These you can often only find in Jefferson, Boulder, Gilpin, Summit, Larimer, and some southern parts of Wyoming. So it's not a very common one. I look at every single blanket flower that I come across when I'm out on a hike. I have yet to find a moth, but I would really love to. If you have one, if you have a picture, send it to me. I'd love to see it. But if you grow blanket flower and have more of them in your landscape, maybe you will be able to find them in your own yard, which would be super cool. We also have really cool moths like the Polyphemus moth, which gets really, really big, 4 to 6 inches. The caterpillars feed on trees, oaks, willow, maple, and birch. And the larvae have a really cool adaptation where once they've eaten the leaf, they actually cut the petiole, the little quote unquote stem of the leaf, so the leaf falls to the ground so that they can't, so predators can't tell that they were feeding. There's other pollinators too, though. There's beetles, over 30,000 species in the United States. Many of them do pollinate, but they might damage the flowers as well. It's kind of an accidental thing that they pollinate. Hummingbirds are a great pollinator. The long tubular flowers that are red, orange, sometimes white, can be a really good source for them. We have a ton of pollinators. Our xeric garden was planted in 2009. So this is year 15 of the garden, and we just have So many hummingbirds in the summertime. It's incredible. Bats are good pollinators. We tend not to have a lot of them here. They tend to pollinate a little bit further south, but kind of a fun one to think about. Or if you go visit elsewhere, further south where there's cactus or agave, you may be able to get up at night and see a bat pollinating a flower. Flies. I talked about flies as well. These aren't your average housefly. They're more of a hoverfly or syrphid fly, but flies can be really good pollinators. They visit many different types of plants, and they might even pollinate shade plants as fairly well as well. Unlike, whereas bees tend to like the ones that are out in the sun. These are not your house fly, however. So they do look a little bit different. You can always tell the difference between a fly and a bee because flies will only have one pair of wings, whereas bees have two pairs of wings, four total wings. Flies have really short, stubby antennae, and they have eyes that meet almost at the back of their head. That's how I usually tell the difference between the bee and the fly. Wasps are going to have some similarities to bees. They are very closely related. They also have four wings like a bee does. They have longer antennae and chewing mouthparts. Generally speaking, though, compared to a bee, a wasp will be almost hairless. They will have a very slim little waist, and they will not have any hairs that carry pollen. Paper wasps, we have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with because they can be really good pollinators. We've only had them in Colorado since 2001. They tend to be a little predatory and they will prey on our caterpillars. So that can be really good for your vegetable garden. They'll eat up your cabbage loopers, but not so great for your butterfly garden. They like any caterpillars. There's not a lot that you can do proactively to get rid of paper wasps. If you find their nest in early stages, you can destroy it. But if once it's fully established, that can be a dangerous proposition. In terms of yellow jackets, putting out those yellow traps about now, sometime in the next couple of weeks, can be a really great way to catch the queens as they come out of hibernation for the winter. Wasps tend to start their hive from a single pregnant female in the springtime, and it grows over the course of the summer. So if you can get rid of that queen, then you don't have a hive at all for the season. I'll pause for a moment here and see whether or not there are any questions from you guys on these pollinators. Then I think we're going to dive into plants, and I'll try and blast through them so there's time for questions at the end. I always look at this talk and it talks like this and try and like cull it down so that I can talk longer. But there's so much I want to share. Let's see. Seeing if there is anything up here. All right. Give you guys one more minute to type things up. I know sometimes you don't know a question slide is coming up. And so let's see. Do bug traps attract a lot of the bug you don't want? I'm thinking Japanese beetle. In terms of those yellow wasp traps, they use a pheromone that very specifically attracts yellow jackets. So once in a while, I've seen a fly or two in there. I think once I've found a honeybee, but like one honeybee. Generally speaking, they're very good at just attracting those yellow jackets. And if you put them out very early in the season, you're generally getting those very large overwintering queens so that you can stop the hive before it even starts for the year or the colony. So it can be a really good idea. Are wood piles good for pollinators? I've heard of keeping branches and twigs in a pile in the yard for beetles. I mean, wood piles are good for a lot of different things. They attract a lot of different wildlife into our landscapes, so they can be good. Are butterfly bushes a bad thing? Oh, that's a good question because butterfly bushes back east where they get a lot more moisture than we do can tend to be invasive, so they get a bad reputation. They do pretty well here, and they really are a good attractor for pollinators overall, so they can be a really good thing. So somebody says they've tried to grow milkweed, but without success. They plant the seeds in the fall and have had no germination. You might try finding somewhere that has one or somebody who has one and transplant one. They tend to have a very large root system. Also, perhaps like do some searching around online and see if you can germinate one inside and transplant it as a small seedling. I will be getting to flowers for pollinators for this whole second half of the talk. Do wood piles need to be kept away from wood structures? They should, yes, you should probably have them away from any sheds or houses or outbuildings, just so that you're not getting potential rot and decay onto your structure itself. But I'm a horticulturist, not a structural engineer, so that's a little out of my purview. Okay, let's talk about promoting our pollinators and what we need to think about. Ooh, I love it. People say that they have tons of milkweed seeds. They are happy to share milkweed seeds, and someone else saw their milkweed sprouting today. They planted them last fall. That's pretty awesome. So when you're thinking about your landscape and your plan for your landscape, think about variety. Choose a mixture of annuals, perennials, woody plants to create a diverse landscape that is friendly to pollinators and just to our wildlife in general. Having diversity in our landscape is really good for plant health and helping reduce disease pressures as well. And honestly, it's beautiful too. Oops. When you're thinking about planting your plants, it's good to consider the time of year, the needs of the plants in terms of its water needs and nutrient needs. You don't want to plant a very mesic plant right next to a very mesic, meaning needing lots of water, right next to a very xeric plant, because one of them's going to get too much, one of them's going to get too little, or vice versa. And making sure that you're preparing your area to have success for your plant. When you're thinking about planting them, planting specifically as well, this is just a little visual guide that I put together a number of years ago. This is a Kniphofia, which unfortunately did not survive for 2 years, but I think it was because I didn't have irrigation. I was hand watering the area, and no plant is xeric when you first water it. But I really encourage folks when you're planting new plants to root wash them. So you can see this was in a pot. You can see the pots over here. I put it into a bucket of water. You can use a tub, whatever you have, and you wash away all of that plant media so you can put it in the ground and its roots can contact the soil that it's going to be growing in right away. This tends to lead to quicker and more successful establishment for the plants. It's a little bit scary the first couple times you do it, but there's also a lot of satisfaction in doing it. When you're thinking about maintaining your plants, even xeric plants are going to need water during their first 1 to 2 years to enable successful establishment. And they might not have as much nutrient needs, so you might not need to fertilize them necessarily. If your soils are rich, if they're high in organic material, you can maybe reduce your watering a little bit to reduce how much nutrient those plants are taking up. How do these Waterwise or native plants grow? Many of our xeric plants are going to take their time. They're going to develop their root systems growing down into the soil long before they push substantial growth up top. It's about a 3-year process. Some you may have heard of it referred to as sleep, creep, and leap. So this was May of 2022. Plants are going in. Last summer, they're getting bigger. I fully expect, this is one of my master gardeners' relatives' landscapes. I fully expect by this summer, it's going to have just jumped and filled in. You're already seeing it for some of them, but it's going to take a little bit of time when you're starting a new landscape. It's not going to be an instant gratification kind of thing. It takes a little bit of time for those roots to establish before you get really good top growth. In terms of managing your plants over winter, it's ideal to let your plants stay over winter. This gives habitat for overwintering bees, wasps, caterpillars, pupae, etc. Also, if you can leave the plants up with their seed heads, it provides a food source for birds and other wildlife. So leaving things up, not quite as aesthetic, but much better for the plants. And for some plants like Agastache, we actually see substantially better overwintering success when it has been left, when the plant top has been left over winter and cut back in the springtime, rather than cutting it back in the fall after that first hard freeze. Okay, let's get into a small selection. This is by no means exhaustive. A little bit of it is biased because these are things that I love to talk about and look at. But options of some hardy plants, tough plants that you can plant to attract pollinators and to bring beauty to your landscape. These pictures are all from our xeriscape demonstration garden in Adams County, at least on this slide. First off, we've got that red hot poker that I referenced. This is Kniphofia, various Kniphofia varieties. It can get fairly large, 2 feet by 1 foot or so. It loves full sun. It's going to bloom in early summer. Very drought resistant once established. Great for pollinators. I've definitely seen hummingbirds and sphinx moths going after all of these little flowers. Blooms for a very long period of time because it blooms up the stalk like this. So you can see these flowers at the bottom are open. There's ones here that have not opened yet. This is not a native. It was native to Africa, was brought here by Penny Odie from Denver Botanic Gardens. So introduced to North America by a person who is local to our area, which is kind of cool. Next one is a native, prairie smoke or GM triflorum. This loves sun, but can tolerate a little bit of shade. So maybe one of those liminal spaces on the side part of your landscape. Does not tolerate wet soil, but does like a little bit of moisture every now and then. It's a very small plant. It's maybe 6 to 8 inches tall, but absolutely beautiful and has these little tufty seed heads that persist for a while after the flower has matured. You're going to notice a theme. I like the tufty flower seed heads. Pasque flower is blooming right now. This is an early season bloomer. If you go out and watch them, you'll see just a whole bunch of native bees clustering in all of the flowers. Tends to have a taproot that doesn't really like transplanting a lot, so maybe plant it young or plant from seed. There are native varieties. This one down here, I believe, is our native. But there's other cultivars and varieties that do wonderfully here as well. You can get reds, pinks, whites, blues, purples, etc. And provide that, since it's such an early bloomer, I've seen it bloom as early as February before. It's a great choice for feeding those early season native bees. Next up is the yellow prairie coneflower, Ratibida calamifera. This is a annual, biennial, depending on how it grows, but it will spread and fill in a space. So this is one to be aware of. If you water a little too much, it could get a little bit overwhelming. It is a native, also blooms for a long period of time. These petals are actually rays. They are not true petals because the flowers are each of these little black dots, and it blooms up that whole hat over time. Very attractive to butterflies and to our native bees. Great choice. You can get them that are yellow. There are also varieties that are red or orange, so it can be a really nice way to go. This one, Poe's Castle Artemisia, is a shrub, which not necessarily great for pollinators in terms of a food source, but can be a really good overwintering habitat or a food source for larvae and immature insects. Milkweed, we've talked about briefly already, but there are many different types of milkweed. There's that showy milkweed that I had in the picture with the monarchs, but there are other varieties of milkweed that can be very, very aesthetic, a little bit more ornamental. Important if you're planting a lot of milkweed, the sap is a milky sap, and it can be a little bit aggravating for our skin. So be careful when you're pruning them back or cutting them, that kind of thing. Both the flowers and the leaves can be important. The flowers are good for all kinds of pollinators. The leaves are what the caterpillars of the monarchs are going to be eating as their exclusive diet. Campanula, an herbaceous perennial. There are native varieties of these. Is butterfly weed a type of milkweed? I believe, yes, it is, if I'm remembering correctly. The problem with common names is that there are sometimes you can have shared names. Let's see. So Campanula, our bellflower, bluebell is one of our higher elevation options. Really great choice for pollinators. Can tolerate some shade as well, which is great if you've got a more established mature landscape and you need some shade loving plants. Blanket flower, I mentioned already. They are a cool season, short-lived perennial. So one thing that I find with some new gardeners, and I did this too when for sure, I planted a columbine and I was so thrilled to have it. And 3 years later, I no longer had it. And I thought, oh no, I've killed it. Really, some of the perennials in our landscapes only live 3 to 5 years, and then we need to replant or allow them to reseed well. So blanket flower is a good example of this. This is that host, that Shinia masoni native moth, which I would love us to all plant more blanket flower so we can get more of those. Somebody asked if native plants are toxic to pets. I am certain that there are native plants that are toxic to pets. I do not know them off the top of my head. I would see whether or not your vet has a list of plants that you should avoid. Like I said, I'm a horticulturist. I don't know much about plant health or animal health. Monarda is our next native one. There are varieties that are nativars or cultivated, but also known as bee balm, member of the mint family. This is going to spread quite easily. So put it in an area that you can either keep that irrigation down or that you're okay with it filling a space. It likes full sun and you're going to get better bloom with full sun, but it can tolerate some shade and it comes in a variety of colors. Plus you can see from that slightly grainy but very cute picture of a hummingbird attracts a wide variety of pollinators. Rocky Mountain penstemon, there are many varieties of penstemon. Some are native, some come from elsewhere. Make sure when you are buying a penstemon to check its zone because there are some that are rated zone 7 or 8, which will do great for a season here, but they're not going to overwinter successfully. But we have dozens of varieties of penstemon that you can grow successfully here in Colorado. Some species are going to self-seed readily. Penstemon mexicali is one that I know of. It was one of my research plants for my master's degree. They will self-seed and spread quite easily. And the wonderful thing about penstemon is that you'll plant it in one place, and 5 to 7 years later, you'll have it in 3 other places, but not that original place you planted it. So embrace the restrained chaos of a penstemon. Most penstemon do tend to be a short-lived perennial as well. So you probably won't have them you won't have one particular plant for more than 3 to 7 years or so. Cashmere sage, another great one for our landscapes, for our pollinators. I see so many hummingbirds on these. They are from the foothills of the Himalayas. So these are one of those adapted to our region plants rather than a native. They can grow in a wide variety of soils. They can tolerate shade. You can get a second bloom off of them if you deadhead them. They do not need very much water once established, and they are just beautiful. And they have just multiple clusters of flowers on one stalk. They're super pretty. If you're near Adams County or near Brighton, you can come to our demonstration garden and check those out this summer. They usually get going by late July or so. Here is a native of the 4 o'clock Mirabilis multiflora, a wonderful perennial. It is one if you plant it, it does have a very deep taproot, so it can be a little difficult to transplant successfully. But once it does establish, it is tough as nails. It can grow in the foothills here in Boulder with no supplemental water once it's established. It loves it hot, it loves it dry, does not need a supplemental fertilizer, but it does take it a while to grow every year. Usually sometime in mid-June or so, I go out and I think, oh no, my 4 o'clock is dead. It's not coming in this year. And then about a week later, I see the leaves pop up. And then a week later, it suddenly feels like it's 4 feet by 4 feet wide and just massive and wonderful. So it's a really good one for covering an area if you need a space filled in. Agastaki, these are varieties in the garden, or there's a lot of different varieties that you can get. They tend to be very showy, fragrant. This is the one I referenced. If you don't cut it back, it's going to have better overwintering. It can get pretty tall. It can get about almost 4 feet tall and almost 3 feet wide. Can get pretty sizable. Wonderful fragrance, great for pollinators. The hummingbirds in particular love this guy. Hens and chicks, sempervivum. These are a non-native perennial. I'd like to include this one in because when they do bloom, they will send up a flower stalk, and then that mother plant will actually die after the flower stalk. But pollinators, especially, I see so many native bees. The little teeny tiny black and gray bees just swarm the flowers of the hens and chicks. So it can be a good one to put in. Ooh, somebody says 4 o'clock looks like bindweed. Are they related? I don't believe they are. It does have a much fleshier leaf than bindweed does. Okay, Hesperella, red yucca. There's a red and a pink and a yellow variety of this. Very large, a much larger plant, 36 inches, not feet, wide. A native it is a native. Has these spiky leaves that look kind of like yucca, but it is actually related to aloe, like we have down in Central America. Has reddish, yellowish, or pinkish blooms on a long spike, and it will bloom through much of the summer. Very popular for our pollinators. I'm guessing somebody just asked how fast the red yucca grow. You'll get a bloom if you plant it this summer, you'll probably get bloom by next summer. So fairly effectively. And these are long-lived perennials. We still have ones that were planted back in 2009 that are blooming each year in our demonstration gardens. Blue hyssop, another native perennial that blooms in mid to late summer. Very tough once it's established. Great attractant for a variety of different insects, very hardy. It is related it is in the mint family, so it can be a little bit spready if it gets too much water in particular. Moon carrot, not a native, comes from Eurasia, but this is one that is very attractive to more unique pollinators. I mentioned those very large black wasps in our demo garden. I see them on this quite often. It's a very unique, very cool plant. It's got kind of gray leaves. There's that Hesperella in the front there, but the moon carrot has these kind of silvery, lacy leaves, larger plant, and just covered with pollinators in the summertime. Rocky Mountain bee plant. This is one of our natives that is just super showy. It looks surprisingly showy for how little moisture it can tolerate. It does need some moisture, but I see it in some of the open prairies in the open spaces in Boulder County and Jefferson County. It can bloom through much of the summer. This also has multiple flowers and it blooms up the stalk. You can see older flowers fading down here and new flowers that have yet to open here. It is the larval host for the checkered white moth, which means the caterpillar feeds exclusively on Rocky Mountain bee plant. This is an annual, so you'll need to replant it year over year or ensure that those seeds drop and reseed for next year if you want to keep it going year over year. But it's so beautiful. Gayfeather or liatris, sometimes also known as blazing star. There are many different varieties of liatris, and some of them can be 6 feet tall. Some of them might be 6 inches tall. There's a lot of different variety. It's another one of those that blooms down the stalk this time instead. So you get a long season of bloom, and lots of different pollinators just absolutely adore it. It can tolerate a little bit more moisture, but there are varieties like Prairie Blazing Star that can be quite drought tolerant as well. Coneflower or Echinacea. This is one of our native perennials. Can tolerate a little bit of shade. If you see it in the mountains, Often it's in like a dappled aspen forest or something like that. It's great for both birds and butterflies and bees, very drought tolerant, and they do have those cultivated varieties, those nativars, that give you a bunch of different colors. They do have varieties where they have bred it so that the seed and the flower part right here has rays in it as well. So it has quote unquote petals throughout the whole thing. Those are very beautiful. They're not going to be as great for pollinators. So if you plant those, plant one of the more traditional or less bred varieties for our pollinators to get some food source. Chocolate flower. I love this guy. Chocolate flower is very well named. It's not the most beautiful flower. It's kind of just your standard yellow daisy looking flower, but it has intensely chocolate fragrance. You walk through in the afternoon, June through the end of the season, and you'll just get that very intense chocolate aroma. Great for pollinators. I see little bees in particular swarming on all of the flowers in there. And once it's established, it needs very little supplemental water. I have it right next to my desert 4 o'clock in my landscape. What about grasses? Grasses can be a wonderful addition to a pollinator garden. Even they're not necessarily a direct food source, but they can be a food source for larvae. They can be a great place for overwintering habitat for any of your plants. You can try things like blue fescue, little blue stem, big blue stem, June grass, blue grama. We do have a fact sheet on grasses 7.232. So if you just Google CSU extension 7.232, you'll get to all of our ornamental grasses. I should have said blue fescue, big blue stem, blue grama, and I think that one's little blue stem and big blue stem. I always like to promote shrubs and trees. So you can also get fernbush. This is a large shrub, 3 to 5 feet high and wide, native shrub, great. It blooms pretty much June through August. And those white flowers attract all kinds of pollinators. Apache plume, this one can be some people love it, some people hate it. It often has flowers and seed heads at the same time. I think it's beautiful. If it looks too messy for you, I'm not going to judge if you don't include it. It is another native, very low water needs once it's established, and a lot of pollinators love those very simple rose-like flowers. Viburnum mini-man has a nice compact growth. Those white blooms attract plenty of pollinators. Once established, it can be very, very drought tolerant. Somebody asked if you can trim or prune Apache plume. You can. It grows back quite well after a fairly hard pruning, but it's not going to ever make it look tidy. It's kind of just got a messy growth habit. Okay, trees can be a good option as well. Some trees can directly benefit pollinators, like this Russian hawthorn right here, but others might just provide good habitat for the larva, or just they might help block the wind so that you get a better landscape overall. So let's look at a couple different trees. I know I'm running low on time. Linden, I put in here with a big giant asterisk because it is not a very drought tolerant tree, and it can be susceptible to Japanese beetle, but those blooms, oh boy, they are popular for pollinators. So if you have a linden already, then don't take it out by any means. Make sure it's getting enough water if you do convert to a xeric landscape elsewhere, and enjoy those fragrant blooms and all of the pollinators that come with it. Eastern redbud can have very early spring flowers, great source for pollinators early in the season. They're blooming right now. They are very adaptable to our soil. If you are buying redbuds, make sure that you're buying them from a nursery in the northern part of the United States. They can be a little bit regionally particular, and they're not going to be as cold hardy if you get them from southern nurseries. It's a great tree for smaller yards and smaller spaces. Caddo sugar maple. This is for those of you who are longing for a true red color in the fall, and autumn blaze maple has disappointed you because they get chlorosis issues. Caddo sugar maple has not shown those problems, and has good heat and drought tolerance, can be a good just addition to your landscape. Russian hawthorn, I mentioned a little bit already. Drought tolerant, very tough plant once it's established. Has a lot of ornamental features, beautiful flowers in the springtime, sets berries. The nice thing about Russian hawthorn in particular, it holds the majority of those berries on the plant until they get eaten by wildlife, so they're not messing up your sidewalks. And then beautiful lacy leaves as well. Kentucky coffee tree I add in here just because it's very nice. It's a very good tree for a landscape. This is one in our demonstration garden, one of the few mature ones that I know of to point out. Caddo sugar maple is not the same as big tooth maple. Big tooth maple is a native maple that hails from the west or the eastern part of Utah into some parts of Colorado. Kentucky coffee tree has a little bit of an awkward adolescence. It's going to look a little gangly when it first starts growing, but it will fill out nicely. Tolerant of some pollution, very tolerant of drought, so a nice addition to our landscapes overall. I did add in here little bit on a clover lawn. Clover lawns can definitely be good for pollinators. They can be good for your landscape. Clover is a legume, so it fixes nitrogen. If your goal is water conservation, you're not likely to save a whole bunch of water by converting to a clover lawn. But you can mix it in with your existing turf. Make sure you're not treating with any herbicides like weed and feed, because that will kill the clover. But there are some good clovers that you can mix in or have in your landscape if that's a goal of yours. Okay, I made it through. Here are some resources for your planting. For the next 8 minutes or so, I'll see what kind of questions people bring in. Let's see, what about letting clover spread under perennial beds? You can definitely let clover grow where you'd like to. It can, I don't want to say outcompete, but it can be a little bit aggressive if it's getting a lot of water. So it might be a little bit better in a turf space than competing with ornamentals that you want to have some space. Oh, and the slide I have up here is just some good resources for where you're planning. I think I had, oh yes, that's just going to be my email. I'll leave this up for a minute while I see if there's any other questions that come in. But Resource Central, obviously, you know who that is. Colorado Waterwise has really good resources. Colorado Native Plant Society is a good place to go if you're searching for natives. If you want those adapted and native-are varieties, Plant Select has good choices, as does High Country Gardens, and a newer nationwide company called Garden for Wildlife. And also reach out to your local garden centers. If they don't have a lot of natives or a lot of pollinator-friendly plants, start asking them, and they're more likely to bring them into your space. Let's see, somebody's asking about poppies. They brought their seeds to the springs. When's the best time to plant them? Generally speaking, for poppies, either you'll want to plant them, start them inside now-ish, or plant them after the last risk of frost has come back. Somebody had Artemisia in California, and they were a nursery for ladybugs. Nice. So it was a good place to bring those beneficials in. They started seeing a whole bunch of tiny alligators. Oh yes, High Plains Environmental Center is a great organization as well. They're having their plant sale at the moment. A good nonprofit. Yes, definitely support them if you can. All right, and I will throw my email up here on the last slide as well. If you have specific questions, if you want to share pictures of things that you have done, I love to see those. And if I really like it, I might ask if I can include it in a talk in future. But happy to answer more in-depth questions outside of this talk. looks like we've gotten through most of the questions that are coming in. So, and I did put together a little flyer that I think Resource Central will be sending out to you with like some bullet points of the things that I talked about in here.
All right. It seems like there's no more questions for Cassey. So we're just going to go ahead and close out. So thank you so much, Cassey, for this presentation. I hope you all learned as much as I did and that you feel comfortable to start implementing some of Cassey's advice in your landscape this year. Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you again to the City of Lafayette for making this seminar possible. Our seminar series this year runs through August, so be sure to sign up for any other seminars that you're interested in on our website. Again, that's resourcecentral.org. When you exit the webinar tonight, you'll see a survey link pop up. If you have a moment to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, just keep an eye out tomorrow for that email that Cassey mentioned. We'll be including some follow-up resources, a link to the survey, and a recording of tonight's seminar. We really value your feedback, so if you can fill out that survey, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and have a great evening. Thank
All right,
you.
thank you guys.